Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's first segment where I dissected the NFC North in terms of fantasy implications. Definitely a very intriguing division to look out for. But we go from intriguing to kind of barren. I'm sorry, guys. It has to be done, like I said before the break. We are going to be previewing the NFC South. Definitely not the best of divisions, but maybe that works out in their favor a little bit because it's so even and anyone can be expected to win except the Panthers. I'm sorry, Carolina Panthers fans, but it's just not going to happen for many years. I still think that because it's so even, there are a couple of players who might rise to the occasion and become one of the breakout stars of the upcoming fantasy football season. So without further ado, let's go right into this segment. Now, in terms of the NFC South, there are definitely going to be a lot of surprises as the weeks go on in the upcoming NFL season. This division could be very volatile from second to second. One team could rise to the occasion, another team might fail to meet expectations, or it could be vice versa. There are definitely a lot of storylines to follow, especially in this division where there's so many different ways a team can win, and it's just getting to 9 wins, I feel like, in the NFC South in order to win this division. Maybe even 8 will do it for you to win the NFC South. But that does not mean I still don't think certain players can emerge and rise to the occasion in terms of fantasy for you guys. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's talk about the surprise team of last year in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Obviously, everyone thought it was going to be a transition year. They had that Super Bowl run with Tom Brady. Brady retired, not coming back. Sorry, Tom Brady fans. But then they bring in Baker Mayfield. Everyone's like, oh, woe is me. What are the Bucs going to be this year? And Baker actually had a shockingly fantastic season. He definitely had some up and down moments, but for the most part, he was a steady presence in that Bucs offense. He finished as QB 17 last year. He averaged 17.4 fantasy points per game, not too shabby. Obviously, those numbers are a little bit deflated and reflective of his poorer games, but still, that's a very good average for someone who has had a very shaky career, being a part of many different teams, a journeyman quarterback, a former number 1 pick as well. But I still think Baker Mayfield is appealing, mainly the streamer option in 1 QB leagues. You could draft him in a super flex league as a QB2, but I think he's going to be a fun person to watch and his progress throughout the season, especially with his skilled receiver core, and choose to pick him come what may as he progresses throughout the season and has his up and down moments. But his receiving cores were probably the most steady in the entire division with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, 2 of the best to do it in the NFC. Mike Evans, what more can we say about him? When all is said and done, first ballot Hall of Famer. 10 straight 1,000-yard seasons. Last year, 136 targets. Always an appealing PPR option. Along with his teammate. His teammate definitely doesn't get as much attention, but Chris Godwin did have 130 targets as well, but only 104 receptions. So I think that the trouble with picking a Bucs receiver is that Baker may want to include Godwin a bit more. Last year I had Godwin on my own fantasy team, and he definitely was disappointing. He didn't get as much attention as Mike Evans. Mike Evans certainly is Baker's go-to guy, but I think this year maybe Mike Evans decreases a little bit in terms of target share, and Godwin definitely can step up. But overall, the Bucs are probably the most appealing fantasy options in terms of teams in this division. Let's kind of go from hero to zero a little bit. We have to talk about the Carolina Panthers. Obviously, if you were to say they're the worst team in football, I wouldn't find any fault with that statement. There's definitely not much excitement around them. However, they can't get much worse than last season. Obviously, there have been only 2 0-16 teams. I don't think it's going to happen for them. They had a lot of coaching changes, and they brought in Dave Canales, who seems to be a QB whisperer. Definitely can help Bryce Young, who we're going to talk about a little bit. Bryce Young, as bad as he was, here's an interesting statistic. He threw more interceptions in his last year at the University of Alabama than he did last year, so that's a silver lining to a very rough rookie season for Bryce Young. I think he could be an appealing super flex option. It all depends on how his receivers help him and how the Panthers organization helped him in the offseason. They added a lot of talent around him. They drafted Jonathan Brooks. If he's healthy, he can be an appealing option at the running back position. They still have Adam Thielen, no matter how old he's getting. They have Jonathan Mingo. And they drafted Xavier Legette, who I really, really like later in the second round. He's a big body receiver out of South Carolina, one of the most underrated wide receivers in the SEC last year. And so I think that Bryce Young certainly has the system around him. It's a question of who can step up. I think the position you look at if you're wanting to pick a Panther, that's a weird statement to say, but it has to be said. I'm looking at the running back position because it's going to be a competition between Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders. Here's an interesting statistic to know. Hubbard started 7 more games. He had more targets, he had more carries, more touches, and more yards. 470 to be exact. So Chuba Hubbard could be a nice little RB3 situation in terms of your fantasy drafts. I think he could be a potential steal. But that's all that can be said about the Carolina Panthers. I wouldn't necessarily say fade anyone because we'll definitely have to see how Bryce Young progresses in his second year. Who knows? Maybe he has a breakout sophomore year, and second-year QBs are definitely more highly coveted in terms of fantasy drafts than others. So we'll certainly have to see with him. But let's move on to another one of the most exciting offenses in this NFC South, mainly due to the changes in terms of their offensive scheme and play calling and changes at the quarterback position as well in the Atlanta Falcons. Obviously, Kirk Cousins comes into the Atlanta Falcons, probably the best quarterback they've had over the past 3 years or so. He's not necessarily the sexiest fantasy quarterback. He's not going to be a 20-plus points guy. He, for the Minnesota Vikings, is just a steady presence. He's a 14, 15, 16 point per game fantasy quarterback. He relied more on his receivers than his receivers relied on him to get them the ball. That's what can be said about Kirk Cousins. But in an Atlanta Falcons system that expects a lot from him, I definitely think he can elevate his game, mainly because of the fact that these young receivers want to be the best they can possibly be. Let's start off with Jake London. Yet to have a 1,000-yard season. That could definitely change if Kirk Cousins looks his way often. Look for Jake London to kind of extend his route tree a little bit. Obviously, he was seen as the vertical threat in this offense, the guy that's going to run a lot of go and post routes. But look for him to change up the way he runs routes, getting more into the short to intermediate areas of the field for Kirk Cousins to look for him. And so that's the way I see Drake London getting those yardage numbers up and getting that fantasy production up as well. He had 117 and 109 targets last year, so that's nothing to worry about there. He's fantastic in terms of PPR. The question is, can those come from different routes that the Falcons run for him? And then let's go to Bijan Robinson. Bijan, obviously we've talked a lot about him on this show. His touches should go up. Raheem Morris wants his touches to go up. It's just a question of where and when they will come from. I think he can be a fantastic red zone threat. I'm a huge University of Texas fan, and seeing his progression at UT, I think that Bijan Robinson definitely has the hunger and ability to progress himself. He definitely wants to grow into this offense, and if Raheem Morris keeps his word, we're going to see a lot more Bijan Robinson in this, and he's going to live up to his fantasy projections as well. But that should just about do it for the Falcons. Let's go to the last team here, and the Saints. The Saints are another one of those teams that could make a couple of noises in the early goings of the season, but I expect them to fall apart mid-season. They're always going to be one of those 7 to 8 win teams that always lingers. Maybe people are hopeful about them to get into the playoffs, but it never happens for them. Let's just talk about Derek Carr for a second. I always try to defend Derek Carr because, in my humble opinion, he certainly has had one of the best deep balls in all of football. He certainly can throw the ball on the field, sling the rock around the yard. But it doesn't translate to fantasy or real life. He was the QB 28 last year with 13.9 fantasy points per game, so Derek Carr is steadily declining. The only player of note on the New Orleans Saints right here is Chris Olave. He had 138 targets last year, 23.8% target share, so obviously Derek Carr relies a lot on him. I think Rashid Shaheed could be someone you look out for later in mid-round picks. Chris Olave is perhaps the only person I would really roster confidently from the New Orleans Saints. But overall, that should just about do it for the NFC South section. Make of this what you will. Draft someone from the Carolina Panthers or New Orleans Saints at your own peril. But coming up next is one of my favorite divisions because it has that team right there in it. The NFC West, the best of the NFC West. Obviously a little bit more top-heavy than it has been in recent years. But we are going to dissect a lot of interesting storylines as well from the NFC West. We will be right back with that final divisional breakdown on the GSMC Fantasy Sports